Okay, let's go ahead and get going today. I'm not often introducing myself and colleagues on these symposiums, but I'm very much looking forward to today's talk. This reproducibility effort, I think Doug might say some about the kind of the genesis of all of this, but it's been probably about a year ago that Victoria Stodden, who's a leading scholar, I think she's been at Stanford and Columbia, now she's at NCSA, has done a lot of work in the area of reproducibility and challenged Exceed as one of its reviewers as to what have we been thinking about this. So there's a lot more interest in the press about reproducibility in science, and especially computational reproducibility, because computational science is such an accepted method these days. So sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here this morning. So the veracity of our computations is increasingly important as they're being used for policy decisions and things like that. So at the large scale, this is quite challenging, and this is some of the things that we first started thinking about at a workshop that we held at Exceed 14, so July last summer. And, Doug and I, when we started talking about this at the beginning, we're thinking, we really don't know all the answers here. So this workshop with contributions from the community and kind of discussions throughout the day we thought was very much the way to start. And so for those of you who could not be at that workshop, this is kind of a summary of what went on there. And we hope you find the discussion useful, and we especially hope towards the end of this presentation that we can all engage in some thoughtful conversation about what Exceed and kind of other high-end organizations can do to facilitate reproducibility for their user community. So what kinds of things can we put in place to make it easier for our users? So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Doug and let him get started here.
Thank you, Nancy. And this seems like the right forum to report back to our friends, but I try to make a hobby out of disagreeing with Nancy, and Nancy said that we're going to talk to you about what took place at the workshop. Yeah, that's true, but I think what we're really going to do is give you 3 reactions to the workshop. That seems like a good way to kick up dust and encourage other people to contribute. So you're going to hear unfiltered, unplugged reactions from 3 of the participants. And I think it's only fair to start by saying that we were only 3 of the participants. I hope I got most of this slide right, acknowledging all the people that contributed in many, many different ways, including many of the folks that are on this call. So you're hearing from 3 of us in this portion anyway, but there are many, many folks who made significant contributions. Now, the workshop itself was a little unconventional, as you'll see, and I hope that our talk today is a little unconventional as well. So what I'm going to do is talk briefly about the workshop itself, then allow each of the 3 of us to react, and I think you'll find that we will differ in our reactions, which is by design, and then invite you to throw tomatoes and contribute your thoughts. The workshop itself, there's a web page that we're pretty proud of, actually, that I think can tell you most of what you'd like to know about the workshop. It's exceed.org/reproducibility. Allow me to overview the workshop itself by sort of walking through the website, and maybe some of you will find something of interest on that website. First of all, the format. Nancy sort of hinted at this, but let me highlight. We thought about running a reproducibility tutorial. That was certainly one possibility, but we quickly abandoned that idea. We thought about running a technical track disguised as a workshop and inviting people in to present papers and argue about bitwise reproducibility. But we finally decided that the right answer for us, at least I think it was the right answer, was to have a food fight. And it was messy, it was fun, and I think it was productive. Call it arm wrestling, call it an interactive, open-ended, discussion-oriented agenda. It was a food fight. What we did was gather a bunch of passionate people in the room and see what was on our minds. And I think that was a good first step, and I like to believe it was a valuable first step. What did we discuss? Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt you for 1 minute. Can you, since you're the presenter right now, can you share the participant list? I think it's a button over towards the right where.
Let me see what if I can, I will.
Okay.
Let's see.
If not, I might have to grab control real quick. Yeah, sorry about that. One thing I forgot to do at the beginning of the.
Okay, let me see if I can figure out what you're asking me to do.
At the right of your screen, you'll see a list of participants.
Right of
might not let you do it since you didn't start the call.
That? I see
like
a list.
Share list. Yeah, up at the top. Yeah, see where it says share list? Right under the word. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Not at all, ma'am.
It's kind of nice to see who all's on, and I forgot to do that.
All right.
Okay, great. Sorry. Back to
Not at all. Not at all. So this is number 6. So what did we gather to talk about? We by design and no great surprise, decided that we wanted to focus on large-scale computational science, although we made a conscious effort to try to draw in folks that had some experience in other reproducibility contexts so that we could learn from them. Victoria Stodden, who Nancy talked about, ran an absolutely wonderful event in 2009 that was, it was practical, it was realistic, it was sort of a lay of the land kind of challenge to the world, in that we decided to try to craft our event as a response to that, and you might be interested in looking at what that original event was. We aimed to see what we could recommend to the community, but the truth is we knew that we were beginning a conversation, or at least continuing a conversation, and we knew that there's only so much you can do in a one-day arm wrestling event. What was the schedule? It was basically 4 discussions. Victoria, who organized the Yale 2009 event, set the tone for us, kind of, a mapping of, where we were in 2009 and where the world has come in reproducibility. She's a specialist in that discipline. And then we sort of went on from, her setting the tone to where do we stand, what can we learn, and what comes next, sort of building a little bit of a crescendo. It was really largely discussion. We did have a couple of lightning talks. They were very loosely correlated with our themes, but the truth is they were nothing more than a professional courtesy. We felt like the folks that took the time to prepare written submissions deserved at least a few minutes of protected time at the workshop, but those talks did not necessarily drive the discussion. They stood or fell on their own merits, and the heart and soul of what we were doing was the discussions. I think of interest to you might be 3 separate things that appear on the website. The first of those things is the submissions. Now, again, deliberately, consciously, with malice, the submissions for this workshop were not peer-reviewed. We did that eyes open. We wanted all comers. We wanted dissident thoughts. We wanted radical thoughts. We wanted unpolished thoughts. And we did get things all over the map in terms of priorities, in terms of points of view, and I think that was sort of the point. And maybe those submissions would be interesting to you if you'd like to browse them. They're on the website. The agenda itself we've already talked about was the 4 big blocks, but you can also find on the agenda page, you can find links to all of the slides that were presented that day for the lightning talks, as well as the one formal presentation we had, which was Victoria's kickoff. But you can also find the final report, and I can tell you that I still bear the scars from trying to assemble that final report. I'm not going to try to summarize it for you here, but I will say that when I think about this event, when you get so many passionate people involved, it's hard to even agree on what we agree on. But we did agree that there were 2 themes that resonated for the group. And the first of those themes came from I think Mark Fahey is the one who best articulated it. He basically stood up and said, the centers need to stand up and take responsibility, that there's things that the centers can do, and here we're talking about the centers understood in the broadest sense of the word, organizational stakeholders. There's things that the centers can do, that organizations can do, that are related to reproducible research. And I have to say that when he said this for the first time, it almost brought a hush over the crowd. And as obvious as it sounded, it really did affect the discussion. The second one was even more profound. I expected that we would spend the day arguing about virtual machines and bitwise reproducibility and what you can't achieve at scale. And again, Mark Fahey, in a way that only Mark can say, would said, you can't VM blue waters. And then Lorena Barba came through and she said, that's true. And maybe the bottom line is that we should conduct our research, conduct our experiments as though someone will want to replicate them. And, reproducibility is a mindset, as though someone will replicate them. I have to say, I think everybody that I've talked to that was at that workshop found that to be an absolutely magical phrase that has changed the way many of us think. But many of us think in many different ways. So now I'm going to tell you the way I think. And of course, of the three of us, mine is the correct way. Now I'm being facetious. I'm going to be deliberately provocative here, and I'm going to stop talking about the workshop, and I'm going to talk about my reaction to the workshop, as will Carlos and Nancy. I was nervous going into the workshop. I'm a process person, a software process person, and a process person in general, and I would be the first to admit that, but I'm not a specialist in reproducibility, and I don't want to be. And I was a little bit nervous about interacting with those that have thought about this a great deal, because I thought, I feared that the folks that were specialists would be, they would be unrealistic or not very practical. And I have to tell you that I was relieved and surprised to see that the specialists, the Lorenas, the Victorias, the folks that have thought about this a lot were the most level-headed, practical-minded, realistic people in the room. And I think the proof of that is Lorena's comment that reproducibility is about conducting research as though someone will replicate it. My own lightning talk was designed to throw down the gauntlet and challenge the specialists into not being so narrow. And so I sort of organized my own talk about this, no thank you, yes please. What I want to do, I don't want to run your code, I want to implement your algorithm, and I don't want to duplicate your environment. I want portable results. And, I'm not interested in bitwise reproducibility. I'm much more interested in understanding the differences between what you got and what I got, this theme of reproducibility bigger than reenactment. And I expected this to be a challenging statement, and I sort of got nods that said, well, yeah, of course. And so that was a real surprise to me. And I tell you this partly so you know my own biases, and partly so if you have your own fears about interacting with the folks who have thought about this a lot, let me tell you, your fears are unfounded. What I took away from this was the following. You can spend a lot of time generating heat instead of light if you argue about definitions of reproducibility. For one thing, narrow definitions, I think, are unnecessary. Reproducibility is bigger than bitwise reproducibility or virtual environments or almost any other reproducibility definition that you decide to propose. And I was surprised over the course of organizing this thing about how much time I spent arguing with people about definitions and how that got in the way. But at the event itself, I was also surprised to see that if you make the definition too broad, that's also not helpful. There were people in the room that were, specialists in, I'm making this up, I'm being facetious, improving agricultural productivity in New Hampshire, and suddenly the definition of reproducibility was improving agricultural productivity in New Hampshire. This idea that reproducibility is everything or reproducibility is whatever I'm working on that's also not very helpful. And so, I had to come out of this workshop and think about my own understanding of what reproducibility was. And this is what I came up with. And I want to emphasize again, this is what I came up with. This is not some official definition. I decided that for me, reproducibility is the ability to revisit an experiment to the degree necessary to assess its correctness and impact. And I chose those words carefully. Revisit could mean anything from repeating it literally to re-implementing the algorithm to simply reviewing the artifacts so that you can do a confidence assessment. And this idea of revisiting could mean many things, and the idea of to the degree necessary, I think, is a really important idea. Depends on your purpose. I came away realizing that reproducibility is about establishing confidence in an experiment, and it's more about provenance and audit trails and record keeping and basic automation, communicating how you got where you got, than it is about anything else. And this may sound obvious, but this was a real surprise to me. I realized that reproducibility is a property of an experiment, not the software. It's meaningless to speak of the reproducibility of NAMD or MATLAB or C. It may be that the software you're using makes reproducibility research easier or harder, but the question is the experiment reproducible, not the software? And once I realized that, that helped me to articulate my own thinking a little bit more precisely. I have to say the biggest lesson of all, though, was this. Many of us in the trenches, the kind of folks that are campus champions and ECSS staff, encounter people regularly that think of reproducibility as yet one more burden being placed on them from afar, something else they have to do to sort of meet somebody else's standard of acceptable research. If you will, it's a tax on my research. And I have to tell you that if I learned one thing from this workshop, it was that the world would be a better place if we could come to realize that reproducibility makes my own life easier. That a reproducible error is a wonderful thing. If I have an error that I can reproduce, I have a fighting chance of finding it. And that if I can automate my own processes and figure out what input files I actually used and what compilers I actually used, my life is easier. Reproducibility is not something you bolt on the end of an experiment so somebody else can do something. It's something that propels your own work forward. And I have to say that I sincerely believe that. And the proof that I believe that, or evidence that I believe that, is I've proposed a workshop for a tutorial this summer at Exceed that is me trying to put that into words. When we automate processes, when we maintain change management on our software, when we do things in a way that preserves provenance and audit trails, our own life is easier. It's something I do for myself, not for somebody else. And I think that's the most important thing I learned. I thought about lessons for my colleagues in ECSS and in work as campus champions and the other kind of folks that are on this call. And just to categorize it briefly, I would say that for the folks that work tickets, for the folks that work ECSS, I think modeling good behavior is about learning to value the reproducer. It's learning to be able to say, give me a small reproducer, or here is a small reproducer, and helping people to understand that the very act of producing that reproducer generally is an exercise in insight. That the degree to which we employ change management, here I'm talking about version control, the degree to which we script or make effective use of portals and gateways, the degree to which we value provenance, to that degree we're modeling good behavior. And I hope that I and others can start to try to communicate this in our work plans and our final reports. The degree to which I can say in a final report, hey, you know, we tried this and it did or didn't work, and next time we'll try to do this a little better in terms of furthering reproducible research. I think that's a modest but important thing we can do. I must confess to a bias. I hope that we don't try to create some grandiose new program in Exceed, and I really hope we never have a course called Reproducibility. What I personally would like to see is I would like to see reproducibility as an attitude sort of permeate what we do. You know, that in my classroom, in my presentations, in my collaborations, that when it makes sense to automate something or to employ change management, I do it to the point where the people I'm working with or the people that are learning from me or with me say, wow, you know, I can see that really is. I just learned from that. And reproducibility isn't something separate from what we do. It's a part of what we do. I also hope that we're humble enough and smart enough to avoid reinventing wheels that other people have already invented. I saw recently an initiative within Exceed to, you know, for example, try to employ a software carpentry, workshop. I think that's a wonderful thing. A lot of people have done a lot of work making that a wonderful program. We don't have to duplicate that when it's already there for us. And, that's sort of my reaction. I will say that if you're interested in this sort of basics or important approach, if there's one paper I would recommend to you, there it is, 10 Simple Rules. It's about the fundamentals. It's about, you know, the importance of change management and automation and avoiding manual steps. And if you haven't thought about this, or you've thought about it in ways that you want to make more precise, that's half an hour of reading that will change, it will rock your world. More generally, if you want to think about common sense approach to managing your software development efforts, there's no better guide than the one I've given you there. I'm in danger here of getting too broad, but I have to tell you, if reproducibility is about common sense best practices, this is the book that I would recommend. Carlos, it's all yours, sir.
All right. Thank you, Doug. So, before the workshop, I had never considered reproducibility in detail. Of course, I had my own opinion. Research must be reproducible, but after the workshop and with 2020 hindsight, I realized how naive I was when I was making this statement. Because at the end of the day, you have this issue that Doug has already brought up. What does reproducibility mean? And reproducibility means very different things to almost everyone that you talk to. In the workshop, we had many different interpretations, lots of idealistic views, lots of very narrow views of this is what I think reproducibility should mean for everybody, which are not wrong, they're just views. From my point of view, what I saw with some of these narrow, very detailed interpretations of reproducibility and requirements for reproducibility, what I found was that they didn't seem very practical, at least not with the kind of support that researchers have today to document and inform the work that they're doing when they present it to others, especially from a computational point of view. My own interpretation after the workshop is completely aligned with Lorena Barba's interpretation. If you want to do reproducible work, you need to perform it, and the fundamental step here is not only perform it, but document it as if somebody else was going to reproduce it later on. And the main reason to do this is not the fact that the work will be reproduced, which it may or it may not, but it's going to create a confidence in your audience, in your peers, that the work has been performed correctly, or at least with as much honesty as possible. Now, you might say, this is a very loose definition. I don't like it. I want you to give me 5 bullet points that tell me how to make my work reproducible, and I'm not going to do that. And if you think about this carefully, this is a very loose definition, but this is the way we've been doing scientific research for a very long time. What we're doing is we've been documenting our work to the best of our ability so that our peers understand what we've done, have the confidence that they could possibly repeat that experiment, and trust our work. And You might say, well, there's so many variables in computational work. Do I need to record the minor revision of the kernel that I've been using? Well, maybe not. But you have the same issue in experimental work. You do experimental physics or you do chemistry, and there are always variables you do not record. There are always variables you do not present in your papers. There's no significant conceptual change between these two. There's always things that you might leave out. I think the key idea here is that you try your best to keep everything that at the time that you did your research you consider important, you consider that could have an influence on your results. You make sure that's documented and that's available for others to share and understand. That should increase the confidence that your colleagues have in the work that you've done, in how complete that work is and how complete your report is. And even though this is a very loose definition, it still imposes a very high bar on you as a researcher. One of the questions that came up in the workshop is, do we have the tools to do this? And the answers were mixed. Well, there are tools, and there are definitely many available tools. We have the ability to open source code so that others can see it freely without running into any legal issues. We have Creative Commons so that we can make documents available to the community. On the other hand, we also have obstacles. Some universities have an attitude towards open source that is not particularly friendly, and so it's a lot of effort on the researcher to get things through. It's also some of the tools that are available to do automatic logging of environment, build, and execution of a particular code are not available on every center, even though they're available in general. And these are areas where centers and Exceed in general can help researchers using computational facilities to improve their work in terms of the ability to reproduce it, in terms of the ability to document what they've done in the first place. It's also true that it's very often not easy to find information about what these tools are and where to get them. And I think that part, the documenting part, is something that could be improved. To make reproducibility work, my fundamental belief, and this is obviously just my belief, is that one has to have the willingness to do it. Reproducibility should be its own reward in the sense that if you do work that is reproducible and that your peers consider reproducible, that means you're doing high-quality work that is well documented, and that should increase the respect that the community has for you. It should increase the likelihood that your work gets published. It should increase the likelihood that people want to collaborate with you because you are somebody that is trustworthy. Now, that does not mean that we don't have the opportunity to encourage people and to reward people for doing reproducible work, and this is something that came up in the workshop, and that I think it's a good idea if we could find ways to provide formal recognition for people that make a particular effort to make their work reproducible. That would be a good way to start spreading the word about reproducibility and improving it. And why the dissemination of resource location would be something that I think is pretty simple for Exceed to document initially. I'm not quite sure what the best way to do this is, but I'm sure we should try to make an effort to at least inform our users of ways to get to the tools that they need to support their work. Wider deployment of logging tools, and I'm using Exalt, which is something that is running at TAC and other centers, but not on all Exceed centers by any means, would be very useful, because this would be a way to provide users with fairly complete information of every job that they've ever run, what kind of environment did they run with, what kind of compiler setup they had when they actually built the binary, and compare it with the compiler setup they had when they run the binary, etc. This is something that is quite onerous for the user to record every time, and if we can automate these and help the researcher get this data automatically, I think this would be very productive. Involving the universities in the process, I think, is important. I've been through the process of open sourcing code multiple times, and even though it's been getting easier as time goes by, because it's something that universities get more familiar with and they get to accept, it's still kind of hard on the researcher, and it implies quite a lot of work and legwork on the researcher side. So this is another place where ECSID might have a chance to interact with the university divisions that are responsible for this, at least with the divisions that are local to the RPs and to the SPs, and try to streamline this process a little bit. I was really surprised by the level of interest and the energy of the discussions. There was nobody in this workshop that didn't have a very specific idea on what reproducibility work was and was very, very willing to share it with everyone. On the other hand, I was also very surprised about how flexible and how open the discussion was. I don't think we had anybody that was just in their own corner, not accepting the opinions of others. It was a very, very interesting, I think, very productive discussion. I was really surprised about how naive and incomplete my idea about reproducibility was after leaving the workshop. Just the sheer amount of work that has happened in this subject in the last few years is pretty impressive. Something that I want to stress is that there are tools out there to support reproducible work. Not only tools, but reproducibility is a frame of mind. If you have a frame of mind to make your work reproducible, you will find the tools that you need to make it happen. So it's not something that we should just punt on because it is not easy to do. What we should try is to make it easier for ECSID users to do their work reproducible, but we shouldn't just be discouraged because the current situation is not optimal. We should just accept the fact that we're going to have to work a little bit harder for a while. Things are going to get better. And that's all I had to cover today. So I'll let Nancy continue.
Great. Thanks very much, Carlos and Doug. Carlos and Doug are going to advance the slides. They're live in ECSS. So we developed our slides independently, which was good. You'll see some of the same things in mine that you saw in Carlos and Doug's, but maybe a few different things too. So I was responsible for kind of wrapping up the workshop, and the way I was looking at this was, okay, what can we do differently as a result of this workshop? What needs to happen in ECSID so we can better support our users, and kind of what specifically can we do? So I was thinking about it from that perspective. Next slide, please. Right, so the three goals that we had coming in were first to highlight the issues. I mean, if you looked at ECSID documentation and web pages and things prior to this workshop, I would be surprised to find any references to reproducibility at all. And it's definitely a growing concern in the community, but I don't see it a lot in HPC. Maybe some of you on the call do. But, you know, topics of supercomputing, this and that, it hasn't, at least for me with many years in HPC, this hasn't been on the radar much that I have seen. So the first and very important step is just kind of highlight the issue, just get people thinking about this. And, you know, maybe they're approaching things reproducibly anyway. A lot of good scientists will be doing that, but just kind of a sanity check for people who might not be thinking about it. And then looking at, you know, what are the unique challenges at scale? It's already been mentioned. What do we need to do in ECSID to kind of increase the awareness, and what kind of tools can we make available so that if you wanted to conduct your work reproducibly, we could make that easier for you. And then finally, you know, communicate some of these ideas to the leadership, which is kind of how you affect change at the programmatic level. So next slide, please. So in the final session of the workshop, what we used was a Mozilla Etherpad. I don't know if any of you on the call have used this before, but it's basically a way for a community to contribute text, and, you know, gets sort of color-coded by the contributors. And so we had all the participants at the workshop kind of making suggestions for, you know, what are some of the things that we ought to be doing going forward. So that was kind of a fun way to involve everyone. You know, you can capture your thoughts in your own words without somebody else taking notes and kind of translating what you had in mind. So that was a nice exercise. I think there's probably a link to that Etherpad in the final report. So the next slide, please. So these are some of the things that we came up with as far as what can we do. So documentation and training materials. So Doug mentioned, you know, maybe we ought not to have a course called Reproducibility, that it ought to be more fundamental to the way we approach computational science. And I think there's a couple of ways we can make that happen. Number one, you know, I think it does, even though this ought to be integrated with sort of how you approach your science, I think that there still could be some write-ups of common things that you could do. So for an example, at a center, we run things called regression tests. So when there's an operating system upgrade or something like that, we'll periodically run the same suite of codes and then, you know, diff the output and make sure, because what you sure want to make sure that you're getting the same computational results after an upgrade. So there are some things that we do as part of running a center that we might also suggest to users. So even just writing up such strategies, I think, would help. The other thing that came to mind as Doug was talking today is that if we're thinking about this as, you know, something that really is incorporated in how you go about computational science, that comes into play much earlier than when you first arrive at Exceed and are running codes. So we have folks in Exceed like Steve Gordon at the Ohio Supercomputing Center who is starting some curricula programs, so he's helping other institutions who are interested in developing a computational science minor or actual curricula. So talking to Steve about how to get these kind of reproducibility instructions at the curriculum level would be helpful. It's always difficult. Academia can be slow to change. It's also so hard to incorporate yet one more thing that you have to learn. Doug alluded to this in his remarks, and so kind of how to fit this in with people who are already struggling to learn their physics and the computational methods for conducting analysis, and now doing this in a reproducible way. So it's not easy, but you know, it's fundamentally important. We can't go forward without this. You know, there will only be less believability among the public if we've got you know, results that are kind of all over the map and that we can't reproduce reliably. So I think as a field, it's really important for us. A couple of people mentioned, well, everybody mentioned XALT, and this is something that Mark Fahey and Robert McClay have developed, and it provides a couple of different functions. One nice thing we'll be looking at is we can measure usage of our community codes, so it's a service we could provide to our SP service providers so they can see how much usage they really get out of something that perhaps they pay a lot of money for and kind of make some decisions there. But what it also does that Carlos was describing is captures kind of the fine detail of your runtime environment and how things were compiled and what libraries you use. So this is the kind of tool that if Exceed has this installed across the service providers, this is some really nice, you know, easy documentation we could write up for the users to give them all the information that they need so that every user isn't approaching this themselves and capturing the OS and compiler versions, everything like that. So, you know, it's really just a couple of simple things, I think, that can have a huge impact on the community, which is really nice. Sometimes it's nice to have things be kind of easy instead of hard. In ECSS, so this is another, probably most of you on the call who are ECSSers will know all about this. I mean, our main activity in ECSS is code optimization and changing a user's code. And so we better be darn sure that those codes are getting the same results after we've made changes, after we've optimized them. So our ECSSers, I'm confident, are doing this today and using source code repositories, and sometimes they're working with the users to use these things for the first time, because now you've got somebody outside your own research group and you need a bit more formality to the process and things like that. So I think that there's a lot that we could gain from our ECSS experience and just write that up for other people, even if they're working in their own research groups, just kind of this need for formality. Science Gateways, it's a tremendous opportunity to kind of completely capture the runtime environment for the users without the users having to do anything at all. The paper from James Taylor that came out of the Galaxy group, the 10 Simple Steps for Reproducible Computational Research, Galaxy was actually developed specifically because James saw a need for reproducibility in bioinformatics. So as a gateway, it's providing all the structure for running your jobs in a reproducible fashion, capturing all the details about what you did and when you did it. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity for gateways. Now, just about 40% of the Exceed users are coming in through gateways, so that will capture an awful lot of people. You know, a few simple changes in something like Cypress are just kind of the confirmation that, in fact, these gateways are capturing that information. And finally, something else that was mentioned at the workshop was, could we, really just raise visibility around the issue by issuing an award of some type for reproducible research? So is that something that we do at the annual conference? I don't know. We didn't talk about that a whole lot, but it's the sort of thing that at least makes people start thinking about it a little bit more. So it's a little bit more of a public recognition. And I think we can go to the next slide here, Doug and Carlos. But that's the basic summary. And I guess what we all wanted to do was, in these last 15 minutes, talk to some of you all about what you think about what we just said. So we've been pretty much talking at you for 45 minutes. And now I'd like some of the folks on the call to jump in and talk about your own experiences with reproducibility, what you think about our ideas. Pie in the sky won't ever work. I think you ought to do this instead. No, that sounded very good. So I will open the floor here, and don't be shy, jump in. Otherwise, I might call on a few people. Do we have anyone who's willing to jump in and comment here first? Okay, how about Jay Alameda?
Let me hit the unmute button correctly rather than hang up the call.
That would have been an easy excuse, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I was like, which one is it? Okay. So I'm wondering. So I mean, this is really cool. I'm really thank you. It is really quite outstanding. The question I have is, what can we do to improve our processes and Exceed, and especially in ECSS to help support our reproducible work? So I mean, for instance, you mentioned the use of source repositories, Nancy, but we do that sort of on an ad hoc level. Now, what if we did that, provided that for all of our ECSS staff as sort of just part of the tools of the trade? And also some software engineering processes that would be helpful. These are more questions than answers, but they're things I've been thinking about a lot. Stuff like that. So I'll stop talking and see if there's any reaction.
Yeah, this is Sergio. So, obviously what comes to mind when we talk about ECSS projects is that, by definition, it has two parties to it, one being the ECSS consultant and the other being the research group we're helping. And so what can be obviously tricky, we know that, is to actually suggest, and more than suggest, in a way, convert or ensure that the group we're helping actually adopt reproducible practices. Because, like in my experience, a lot of folks who develop their own like physics code or whatever, they don't really have a lot of knowledge of software practices or even of repositories. So like if one postdoc or student messes with the code, they change it, they're not going to check it into a repository. So can we actually, as a condition almost of helping them in ECSS, can we kind of say, step 0 in the work plan is thou shalt adopt, that thou shalt use CVS or whatever, or, is that realistic? Should we impose that as an additional constraint or on whom we help?
It's an excellent question.
Can we persuade, give it some time, kind of use gentle persuasion and, knowing that, just mention it and say, hey, this would be like really good. And, I use it all the time. Maybe they're not, but,
No, I don't know if we can impose it. It seems like a good idea to, at the very least, suggest it at the beginning of every.
Yeah, and then we could do some work by example. I mean, as part of the collaboration, maybe we can show some of the better practices, and then at the very end, have like a code review with the group to demonstrate what's been done, and and then verify that yes, indeed, we're still getting the correct answer.
Right, like, do you know what the correct answer is, would be the first question.
Yeah, right. It's a good place to start.
Like, how are we going to know that we're not messing anything up?
Right, absolutely.
And I found surprisingly few people actually ask themselves that question.
Yep, and there's some groups that are very good at this. I won't name who they are, but there's some that are quite...
Some are.
Right.
So, yes, I mean, if we could make that part of the educational mission, as it were, of working with people, like, okay, you want to collaborate with me? Okay, I have my, whatever, CVS or, and for us to, and as long as we work together, we are going to use.
The conference today, is this for what you're doing later? Later today?
Sorry, that's somebody else who's not on mute, I think.
Oh.
Those are really good points, Sergio. I think I think it's thinking about that fine line too, like Carlos was saying, how it's not just some other requirement that you're doing to get it out of the way, but you really don't want to be bothered with it. So how we, kind of approach it as this actually help in the long run. So I wouldn't be inclined to say we will not work with you unless you use a repository, but really for the ECSS or just to feel comfortable with their own work, they're probably going to use one whether the group does or not, I would kind of think.
Well, and maybe this could be a topic for our next ECSS all call, or maybe...
I think it could for our face-to-face, huh?
Yeah, meeting at Exceed 15. By the way, did I hear from Doug that you are going to have like a tutorial or something, or another workshop at Exceed 15?
You heard that I've submitted one. I mean, whether I have it or not depends on peer review.
Is that an independent workshop, or is it a tutorial, or what is it?
It's a tutorial. I confused Jay with the same thing. It was just a tutorial submission.
Okay. All right. So there's going to be talk about this anyway at Exceed 15. So, because I'm not sure, frankly, how many CSS consultants also, as a matter of course, insist on doing every project in a repository, and maybe we should train them on it, or also even as a topic for internal training or something like that. But make it clear to them that we expect them to do that in every project. Maybe work towards that.
So this is Mats. I don't think Marlon is on the call, but he has had the same discussion in the Gateways calls, and I think he actually even set up a common repository that we could use as a fallback. If there was not an agreement between the ECSS and the project, there was a repository that we could fall back on and use at least temporarily. And I want to second that as well. I was recently in a project that ended up, having a difficult time even reproducing their own things when people left the project. So I think it's a really important thing to do. And we talk about
and obviously the gateway teams are in a good position to then, ensure the reproducibility of everything that their end users do using their gateway. So in principle, that's the way to scale to many scientists, is if the gateways folks follow those practices, because they control the environment.
Matt, I wonder what you've seen. So in the workflow world, you probably have hooks also written into the workflow packages.
Yeah, and it's basically a feature that we are trying to, a feature of a workflow system that we're trying to sell to users, right? And we're talking about the different level of reproducibility. We're talking about, obviously recording the steps and recording the flow of those steps and the data movement. But we're not really talking much about capturing compilers or anything like that. We also, we do capture the environment that we run in, right? We're talking about, for example, just the Unix environment. But I think the missing piece there is kind of to reapply that to the next workflow, saying I want to do the same kind of environment. And that's the missing piece, right? So most of the time we call it provenance instead of reproducibility, right? We're saying that we'll collect enough information for you to see the environment you ran in, but we're not providing tooling to reproduce that environment fully.
Right, but if it were provided as an output, you might easily be able to, kind of slurp that up and include it with the metadata around a run.
Yeah, and that was actually our kind of contribution to the workshop. We had a student that was working on this, and I would still label this as very researchy. I wouldn't use it in production, for example, but it's an interesting concept. And his idea was to be able to take the captured environment and then create VMs and recreate that environment fully. But as we talked about, it's not working on different resources. I think that was mostly future grid that work was done on.
Yeah, I'd also be interested in how Open Science Grid handles that, because they have such a kind of a changing nature of resources underneath. I think that might be interesting to see how other groups do that. I don't know if you've had a chance to listen in closely during the call, but there's a couple of campus champions on the line, I think. I see Andy Sherman from Yale and possibly Timo from UCLA. I wonder, at the campus level, have you encountered reproducibility issues at all?
It's not something that comes up a lot at Yale, at any rate. Although I think that one of the potential issues that's going to come up here over time is that we now have people who are trying to do effectively similar computations in half a dozen or more different HPC environments, and trying to figure out how to make that work effectively for them is somewhat of a challenge, I think.
What kind of different HPC environments? Just different machines that you have on campus?
We have a couple of different ones on campus. They make use of Exceed resources. These particular folks that I'm thinking of also use Yellowstone, and occasionally use either NERSC or Argonne, depending on what they're doing.
Right.
Every one of those has slightly, in some cases, maybe more than slightly different hardware, and they have different installations of various packages, and not all of them are installed consistently, although users at the level of scientists may not recognize that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking back to Doug's presentation, and Victoria's initial work, that was this Yale 2009 roundtable, and I think, I'm trying to think of who was involved in that. I think
I was not. I think on the science side, Mark Gerstein, who's a big genomics researcher was the primary person who was involved in the science side. It was actually organized by people at the law school.
Right, that's what I was thinking, that it really didn't hit the computational folks there, which is interesting. Timo, I don't know if you're on and listening in, if you had any observations from UCLA.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you. Yep.
Oh, yeah, hello. This is Timo from UCLA. I've been using XSEED for my computational research in quantum chemistry, and I have experienced some differences in runtime limitations that you have in comparison to the on-campus resources on UCLA. So on UCLA, it is indeed possible to run some computational calculations for up to like 5 days or so, and I experienced some limitations with the XSEED there. When it comes to further details of computational architecture, I think I'm not so much in-depth informed about what is really going on at the deeper levels of these processes. But I'm very interested in listening, so thank you very much for letting me participate.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for joining. Do you see any differences in your own reproducibility when you have kind of these long run times at campuses versus the shorter times that make you checkpoint and restart on XSEED?
Yes. So when you have to restart from the checkpoint file, then eventually the calculation will yield other structures, and you will eventually maybe also get different results. I don't know to what extent this is significant, though.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I could see how that might, have a slight effect. We're at the top of the hour. I know Doug, Carlos, and I greatly appreciate this animated discussion. Was there any other points that folks on the call would like to make before we end the call? Well, thank you very much. I don't think this will be the end of our discussion about reproducibility. Hopefully you'll see more things from XSEED on this in the future, and especially more things that make it a little bit easier to conduct your research as if. Hopefully we can give you the right tools for that. So I want to thank Carlos and especially Doug, who really did the hero's job of organizing last summer's workshop and writing up the final report, and really leading XSEED in this very important area. So thank you very much, Doug. Okay, everyone, that ends this month's symposium, and we'll have our next one in May. We've got 2 great speakers in May, so look forward to seeing or listening to some of you then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.